This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Mark Arey. He has spent 30 years of his life as a Greek Orthodox priest until he resigned from the ministry in 2013, and I should say, married the love of his life. He is doing nonprofit work. He's living in Taos, New Mexico, and I want to just say that through the miracle of modern technology, Phil is in Los Angeles, Mark is in Taos, New Mexico, and I am in Gothenburg, Sweden. So we are here together to talk with Mark today. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to come on with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mark, let's begin by giving our audience a sense of your background and most specifically, what brought you to your original choice of joining the ministry and why Greek Orthodoxy?
Okay. It's a long time ago in my life.
It's okay.
Well over 40 years. I was a priest for 34 years, actually, and I became aware of Orthodox Christianity through two interesting sources. One, the writings of Thomas Merton. Even though he was a Roman Catholic, he was aware of Orthodox sources. And two, as a person who majored in languages, a real love of the ancient Greek language, which is my avocation as a translator of ancient Greek. So that's how I got introduced and went to seminary and was ordained. In those days, there were very few non-Greek clergy. I was a convert to the faith. I had been raised as an Episcopalian.
Okay, Mark, when you left the church, when you resigned as a priest, you were married, and that was in 2013. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in the Greek Orthodox Church, as opposed to the Roman Catholic Church, a bishop is supposed to not be married, but a priest can be married. Is that right?
That is correct, but I was married previously and divorced as a very young priest. And in the Orthodox Christian tradition, priests may never marry. A married man may become a priest, but once you're ordained, whether your wife divorces you or whether your wife even dies, you're not allowed to remarry. So in order to remarry, it was necessary to give up active ministry.
Interesting. Mark, can you give our audience and us a greater sense of the difference between the Greek Orthodox tradition and the Roman Catholic? I believe you're the first person to have that kind of training that we've interviewed. How is it different?
Well, it's really very simple. For the first 1,000 years, the first millennium of Christianity, they were the same church. For the second 1,000, they have gone separate ways, primarily over administrative issues, meaning Orthodox Christians do not accept the primacy of the Pope of Rome over the entire church. And there are other doctrinal, philosophical differences, but that's really the sticking issue, if you will. But Orthodox Christianity is also, even in its current form, really strives to hold on to very ancient forms, ancient understandings and philosophies that have influenced Christian thought. You know, as we all know, Jesus was Jewish. He was not Greek. He was, and Christianity adopted Greek philosophy and philosophical forms in the same way that Roman Catholic philosophy much, much later adopted certain philosophical forms. And that's actually where I'm at now as a person, as a human being, is that I think it's time for Christianity to rethink some of its forms, because first of all, I don't think they speak to people as loudly and clearly as perhaps they did. And second of all, I think we've evolved as human beings, and we need to find new ways. One of my favorite quotes goes back to my inspiration to become a clergyman in the first place is from Thomas Merton, when he said the night before he died, Zen and Christianity are the future.
Mark,
Yeah.
the decision to leave the priesthood, having served for 30 years as a priest, I'm sure wasn't an easy decision. Or was it? Is it something you thought about for 6 months or a year or 10 years? And was it a sudden decision? And once you made that decision, how did the church react to your leaving?
Well, as I like to say to people when they say was it hard to leave after so long? I say, well, you haven't met my wife, have you? So it was
Uh-huh.
actually a very easy decision for me. And I think in one way I was ready to move on anyway,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly falling in love with my wife, Lynn, and deciding to get married, that was a huge influence. On the other hand, I have a wonderful relationship with the church to this day. I mean, I worked at a very high level of administration. I was the ecumenical and interfaith person for our national church. I worked on international issues. About a third of my ministry was as an administrator, two-thirds as a parish priest.
Right, right.
Uh,
But
but
Is there anything you miss about it?
no,
mhm.
All right.
And they were good with
Simple
you.
answer.
Yeah,
it really is a simple answer.
yeah.
But there's really, I mean, like a lot of things, 34 years is a lifetime for many people,
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
more
Yeah.
than a lifetime. So, you do something for a certain amount of time, and then you move on to other things. And I moved on.
And the church was okay with it, and you still consider yourself a Greek Orthodox.
Oh yes, well, people sometimes ask me because of the things that I write, and are you a Buddhist or a Christian? And I say both and neither.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure, but I do consider I'm very much a part of the Greek Orthodox Church. I'm still very involved behind the scenes, usually with different projects and clergy, and I still know and have good relationships with everybody that I worked with formerly.
Right.
Uh, Mark, one of your books, I think the most recent, is called The Gospel of Love, a meta translation. And in the write-up I've seen for the book, it said that it treads a new path of interfaith experience by telescoping to the core of the gospel through the non-theistic lens of Buddhism. Can you explain that? And in so doing, let us know how your colleagues in the church would respond to that or have responded.
Well, by saying telescoping to the core, what I was intending was that to get to the meat of the issue, what does the gospel of Jesus, the Christ, call us to? What was he really preaching? And that's why I did a meta translation, meaning I not only translated it from the Greek, but then I changed some of the words so that it would be more intensely felt what the translation was trying to convey. The main thing I did was to change the word God, Father, and Lord when they referred by Jesus or one of his disciples and use the word love instead. It sounds very simple, but when you read it, especially if you read it aloud, it sounds a lot different and it gives a different understanding. The Buddhist side of it was to take the realization of shunyata, of voidness or emptiness, and compare that to the Christian idea of Trinity, which is, and the comparison was very simple, that things are related to each other and nothing exists intrinsically. Even the Trinity is a series of relationships and not some absolute being. I think that people really get hung up with God and God concepts when they think of it as a being off somewhere observing humanity, the watchmaker or the clockmaker or Aristotle's unmoved mover. And these are all philosophical influences, but I don't necessarily think they're Christian at the end of the day. And I think that putting a Buddhist lens on and looking at it from a different perspective can be very helpful to people. And that's why I wrote the book.
Interesting. Dennis, can I follow up on that?
Go ahead.
The first part of what your answer, Mark, you referred to what some might think of as taking liberties with translation. Can you give us an example of some familiar part of the gospel that you changed to make it, in your eyes, more authentic sounding?
Well, sure. I mean, just the first line of the Gospel of John, which is probably the most famous, in the beginning was the Word,
Mm-hmm.
and the Word was present to love, and the Word was love.
Huh.
That
Interesting.
sounds much different than
Mm-hmm.
what most people are used to. And I explain in the book, in the introduction, which I think is sufficient, if not too much, how and the rationale, because all translation at the end of the day is interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And all interpretation, as Susan Sontag said, is translation. I mean, so taking it to a different level, if the reader accepts it, and I understand that there are many people who would not accept it, who would say that I'm tampering with the text. But,
Mm-hmm.
in as much as there's how many? 5,000 different versions of the New Testament in manuscript form,
Uh,
and how many translations? And so,
mhm.
everybody tampers with it
Right.
at one level or another.
Interesting. Mark, question about Christianity and its relationship to Buddhism. I grew up Roman Catholic, and when I think of Christianity or Catholicism anyway, I think of the emphasis being on doctrine, even though there are spiritual techniques, and it is
Mhm.
there is a tradition of experiential spiritual practice and whatnot. When I think of Buddhism, I think of the emphasis not so much on doctrine, but of spiritual technique, of experience. Uh, how does that mesh for you? How were you first introduced to Buddhism? And in your own life, how do you integrate the two?
I'll start with this latter half first. I was first introduced to Buddhism. Again, I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance when I was 14 or 15 years old.
Great book.
A fabulous book. Read Zen and the Birds of Appetite when I was 40 years before I knew what it meant,
Mm-hmm.
or could really appreciate it. And I had some exposure as a young man, but as I even say in my introduction, I was afraid because, the absolutist monotheistic view of Christianity, or of all the Abrahamic faiths actually, pushes back against anything else, I think, and tries to own the whole space. So it really took a long time for me to come back to it. It's interesting, my last 7 years as a priest, I was also the director of all interfaith activity in the Greek Orthodox Church of the United States. So that was a great position in which to explore. And then my wife, who is a very spiritually sensitive soul, and I became members of Tibet House in New York City. I don't know if you're familiar with it,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
but that became a spiritual home to me. Became friends with Bob Thurman, and really started to study and to read and to expand my own point of view. And that's kind of how I've landed where I've landed now. And I'm really enjoying it because I feel more Christian today because of my study of Buddhism. That's why I say I'm neither one nor the other, but I'm both all at the
Mm-hmm.
same time. And I'm not a syncretist. I'm not trying to mesh things and make them work. You see, going back to the first part of your question, there's dogma in the Christian church, but there's also teaching. Jesus was a teacher preeminently, and goodness knows Siddhartha Buddha was a teacher, and that's one of the meanings of Dharma, as we know. So they were both teachers, and they were trying to teach people to live a different way. Um, I see similarity. I don't see that one is, meditative technique as opposed to
Right.
a series of propositions that you accept. I think that's part of the problem of Christianity right now is that the propositions don't mean much anymore. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
what Christian person, really thinks about the Trinity on a daily basis? Nobody that I know. They may
Not many.
toss
Yeah.
themselves or say that's a holy formula. I'm supposed to shut
Mm-hmm.
my eyes, genuflect, or do this or do that. But it's more Pavlovian than it is an internalized experience.
Mark, you mentioned early in our interview you felt the need for Christianity to, quote, rethink its forms. Could you expand on that? What do you mean by the forms, and what in particular do you think needs to be rethought?
Very specifically, I mean, the forms come from two different places. They come either from Judaism, and Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. And if you read the Old Testament with Christian eyes, you can see Jesus and the sacrifices and all these things. Or it's Greek metaphysics of the early first century. Neoplatonism, Platonism, Socrates. How can three be one and one be three? All these formulas that the ecumenical councils of the first 8 centuries of Christianity came up with. And that's all fine and good. But what they've left us with, I think, is a theory of punishment. And it's interesting to me that Jesus, the idea of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, and I don't know if I never saw the Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson movie. Maybe you guys did, or know people who
I did not. Yeah.
I actually refuse to on, moral terms. But the reality is that people see Jesus as either this, bloodied sacrifice because we're all so bad, God had to kill his own son, or it's become this dialectic of philosophies about God as if there's some being out there that we can penetrate with our human mind. I find them both weak. Just to give you an example, Jesus ended animal sacrifice during his ministry, right? He drove the animals out of the temple.
Right.
In a sense, he ended animal sacrifice. But even the early Christians were still going to the temple and offering sacrifices. They didn't really get their teacher's action into themselves. So why would God want a human sacrifice if Jesus ended animal sacrifice?
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, I've never understood that.
No, but Mark, let me ask you. I mean, doesn't the Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, don't they emphasize those two things? Number one, that the suffering and the bloodied Christ that died for our sins. That's emphasized over and over again, and also that God is a being up there that you should be communicating with and talking to every day. Jesus is a being somewhere that you should be talking to every day. Isn't that emphasis still in the church? And if, based on what you're saying, are you somewhat of a maverick, and are you fighting the establishment when you say what you say?
Well, I think, the idea that God's a being, we're supposed to have this transactional relationship with him, seems to me to be a little childish, if not child.
But that's what the church emphasizes. That's what they want you to think. That's what they wanted me to think when I was being raised as a Catholic.
Yeah, that's not what I emphasized when I was a priest for 34 years. So I'm not sure everybody. I understand where the weight of it is. That's why I say it's time for a new lens. Let me just give you a 2-second different interpretation of the sacrifice of Christ. Maybe the sacrifice of Christ wasn't so much this kind of penitentiary punishment, atonement theory that comes from the Old Testament. There's no doubt about it, and was really expanded by the church as almost a means of control of people. Maybe it instead was, as the Tibetan Buddhists talk about, a chode practice of himself, where he literally, chode, the practice of cutting the ego. And there are all these images of even from Milarepa, offering your body to the gods for you to be devoured, so that, and these are all understandings that you're hacking off the ego and getting to the core of reality, which is your entire interdependence with everyone else. I think there's a different way of looking at Jesus' death. Or, as we say in the Greek Orthodox Church, he conquered death by death. If you look to Buddhism, that's what Yamantaka is, the wrathful form of Mandrashi. He's a conqueror of death by death. So there are other, and this is actually, I'm writing a another book, like a sequel to the Gospel of Love called The Kingdom of Love right now, where I'm really getting into that aspect. I realize that some people will not want to hear of another paradigm to explain the meaning of the historical, quote unquote, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I get that. But what I'm hoping is that there are enough people, there's a lot of Christians out there, or at least people who, use the appellation, that there'll be enough people that they'll look at it and say, wow, that's an interesting way to look at it. As far as the church goes, I don't expect the church to take my translations or my works and teach them in our seminaries. No. And that's okay, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm trying to offer something that's different for Christians not to give up on Jesus. Jesus is a remarkable figure. I mean, even the Dalai Lama has said that he believed Jesus to be a fully enlightened being, or at least he says a bodhisattva of a very high nature. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot with Jesus that we're missing because we're still trying to pound him into these old forms, which were used, and let's be honest, gentlemen, 99% of religion is about control. Usually 1% is about transformation. And it's supposed to be the other way around.
Right. Well put. Phil?
Mark, speaking of your works, on your website, it looks like you've worked on 2 graphic novels, one of which is based on the Book of Revelation. So 2 questions. One, why a graphic novel? And 2, what is your take on this really mysterious and strange volume called the Book of Revelation, which has been, mystifying people for 2,000 years? What is your particular take on it?
Well, the reason we did a graphic novel, it wasn't my idea, it was actually a friend of mine's idea. And it was a collaboration between an artist, an adapter, Chris Coley, fabulous artist, Matt Dorff, great adapter, my translation. And we had a lot of fun doing it. We really did. And it was actually a relative success for a while. It's the full book. All it is the Book of Revelation, 22 chapters, 404 verses, 570 illustrations, I think. It's very well done. As far as the Book of Revelation goes, we took in the book a view from the 1st century AD. So you see the Roman Empire reflected in it because, of course, that was the experience of John, whoever this John really was. I happen to believe the same one who wrote the Gospel, but he was a man of the 1st century AD. My take is very simple. I don't know what the Book of Revelation really means. I do know this. It ends on a very hopeful note, which it ends with things getting better and with this sense of restoration. And there is in many traditions this idea that we come to the close of certain ages and there's a conflagration or a flood or a disaster or a cataclysm of some kind, and then we move on into a greater consciousness and life. Christianity posits something which is usually most people ignore. We do posit infinity. We believe that God is infinite. So if things are infinite, there's no end and there's no beginning. So, the Book of Revelation might just be a vision of one cataclysmic spasm of the human family. And some of it clearly already happened, meaning the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. That was cataclysmic for not just the Jewish community, but for the early Christian community. It was just as cataclysmic. So, how much of this is interpretation, vision? I don't know. But we certainly enjoyed trying to put it into images. It was a fun project.
Mark, we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to, you're the executive director, I believe, of the Hellenic Initiative, a nonprofit. Tell us about your work with that.
Well, it's a great organization founded in 2012 by diaspora Greeks meaning Greek Americans, Greek Australians, and people from Europe, in response to the real tragedy, the economic tragedy that is Greece and is still ongoing all of these years later. We do philanthropic work and we do economic development work. We raise money outside of Greece and we spend the money in Greece. I've been privileged to be its executive director. I'm in my fourth year with them. And we do good work, and I'm proud of the work, whether it's helping refugees on the islands, feeding hungry children, giving kids vaccinations, or enabling doctors to go to very remote Greek islands. There's 600 inhabited Greek islands amongst the 3,000.
Wow.
They don't have a hospital or a doctor on each island. So we help in that way. And we also we're very encouraging to the entrepreneurial community in Greece, which is nothing like it is in this country, but there are still great entrepreneurs, and we're trying to help them and encourage them find capital, which there is none in Greece, liquid capital, and things like that in order to help, rejuvenate the Greek economy, because at the end of the day, that's what it's going to be about. You've got to get these people. You can't have a population under the age of 30 at 55% unemployment. That's just, it's intolerable. In America, if you had that in a community, you would say the city in which that's happening is going to implode. Greece has a very strong social structure, which is good, and it has held the country together, but it still needs help. And this is one organization that's just trying to do the best it can.
Very good. Mark, one quick question coming back to your theology and your evolving view of Christianity. To what extent, you mentioned Thomas Merton, the great Thomas Merton, to what extent do the Christian mystics of old, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, to what extent are you inspired by, or have you learned from them? And to what extent are they part of the Greek Orthodox repertoire, so to speak?
Well, of course, you're mentioning mystics of the West, whom I have read, all of them. I used to carry a copy of Ascent of Mount Carmel around in my back pocket in high school of Juan de la Cruz. I've been more inspired, though, because of my Greek Orthodox background, by the ascetic fathers and mothers of the deserts of Egypt, where
the desert fathers.
Much of the desert fathers will remind you of the Zen masters. They truly will.
And the yogis.
And yes, indeed. And also the great writers of something that's called, and it is available completely in English, the Philokalia, The Love of Beauty, which is a 5-volume set of mystical writings, including Saint Isaac of Syria, who was a Persian 7th century saint. Tremendous depth of mystical experience in them. And you sense that commonality with all great mystical experiences of the beyond or the infinite or of God, whatever your lingua is for that experience. So I have taken great comfort and inspiration from these, especially the desert fathers. I find them to be extremely profound. I'll give you one quote. It's from a monk whose name is Agapho, which means good in Greek. And he says, "If I could, I should like to find a leper and exchange my body with his. This for me would be love."
Wow. Very nice.
It's just stunning.
Powerful stuff that I wish I had heard more of when I was growing up from the church. But one last question for me, Mark, and that is, I think you mentioned in the beginning that Thomas Merton had said the evening before he died that, and he did die unexpectedly, that the future was the synergy of Christianity and Buddhism. Do you think that's the case, and what might that look like?
I think that is the case. I'm not sure what it looks like. I feel like I'm a worker, a day laborer digging a hole right now, maybe that someone else will lay a foundation in. I'm just trying to clear some ground and talk about it in a way that's not scandalous to Christians or will turn them off, but in a way that will help people to say, gee, I could look at it this way. And that seems to make some sense. It's interesting. I've had a number of clergymen read my book, friends, who loved it. And I've been kind of surprised. I thought they would be more scandalized by some of the things I said. But yeah, that's how I think it is the future. But I don't think the future is infinite. I think it's fine for us to take this lifetime to dig down some post holes and let somebody else actually do the building.
Very good. Mark, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Really appreciate it, and we look forward to having you on sometime in the future. So, great work you're doing with your nonprofit, and any book or other information that you want to share with our listeners.
Well, just the Gospel of Love, a meta translation, available on Amazon. And there you can see all of what I've done, just the 4 books that I've done. But I'm looking forward to doing more.
Great.
We'll have links. We'll have links when we put this up. Thanks for joining us. Keep up the good work, and
Thank you,
we'll
gentlemen.
see you around.
Thank you.
All right, brother.
All right, bye.
Thank you.